A year and a half ago, I went to a sourdough bread making class. And as part of that class, we were told that when it comes to baking our bread, if we are using a Dutch oven, which I am, what we should do is preheat our oven with the Dutch oven inside of it to about 250 degrees Celsius. Then let it heat empty for about an hour before putting in our bread and baking the bread for 30 minutes or so. And even back then, when I knew very little about sourdough, that advice seemed a bit ridiculous to me and like a waste of time and a lot of money having the oven just running empty. And so I never really followed it. Maybe only a handful of times when I've actually forgotten that I've started preheating my oven, and so it kept running for a very long time. But usually I would either put in the bread as soon as the oven was preheated or just keep it heating for 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes before putting in the bread. And I always achieved a pretty good result. Now, recently, I've started questioning and testing some of the sourdough advice that the internet is full of, and I've already learned a couple things. One, you don't actually have to do stretch and folds with your bread, and two, you can totally use a complete discard starter for your bread. It doesn't have to be active and bubbly. If you're curious about those things, I'll link the playlist up above. Now, I was really excited to try not preheating my oven at all, starting with a cold oven and putting the bread in right away and just baking it this way. I was excited because a lot of people have mentioned this in the comments on my previous videos, that this is how they bake their bread and it totally works for them. I've also seen a couple videos on YouTube where people have done this with their breads and they've got the exact same result with a preheated oven and a cold oven start. When it comes to the test result for me, it was not what I expected. It's kind of a fail almost, except there are a few very surprising things about the result of this particular test, and I cannot wait to hear your comments on what I have experienced as part of this test. Now, I'm not doing this like the other tests where I would make the bread and bake them at the same time, one with something, the other without something, or whatever different circumstances. I have actually made 4 different breads across 4 different days in the last 2 weeks or so. But I feel like the test results are pretty solid. So I have made one kind of standard loaf of bread. So I just want to mention that I have made the bread itself the exact same way for all of these breads. It was just the baking part that was different. And so first up, we've got my regular bread, let's call it that. If you've seen my other videos, then you already know the recipe. So what I do is I combine my 2 kinds of flour. I add some salt and some caraway seeds. I add water and I add my starter. I mix all of this in, make a little bit of a boule out of this in the glass bowl that I'm using. And I'm letting it sit on my counter for about 2 hours covered with this silicone bowl cover. After those 2 hours of the bread dough fermenting at room temperature, I shape it, put it in my Benetton basket, and then it goes into the fridge overnight, and it's the next day that I bake it. So again, I just filmed this once because it was the exact same process for all of these breads. The only difference was then the baking technique. So with my regular standard bread, what I did is I preheated the oven, and the oven is a little bit tricky, the one that I have, because the only signal I get about how much it has heated up is this little red light in the corner. So when the oven gets preheated, the red light turns off. There is no sound signal. Like you can actually hear the click of the light turning off, but that's pretty much it. There is no beep, nothing like that. And you cannot see, there is no display. You can't see like a timer of how long it's been preheating or anything like that. I did have that in my older apartment, and so that's where I could kind of see more clearly how long the oven has been heating up. So here it has been just kind of a eyeballing, just trying to estimate, well, it's been heating up for about, 45 minutes in total, preheating plus heating up afterwards a little bit. And that was pretty much what happened this morning. I've put the bread in, scored it, of course, put it on a parchment paper, and then put it into the preheated oven with the preheated Dutch oven inside of it, closed the lid, and let it bake for 20 minutes. After those 20 minutes, I did an additional 3 or so at a lower temperature of 200 degrees just to get the crust a little bit more golden and brown. And that was it. I got a very standard result that I'm used to, a nice puffed up bread with a nice crust on top of it. And when I slice into it, you can see how puffed up and squishy it is. And now to the other 3 breads that I have made using the cold oven start. And actually the first one is kind of only halfway there, because what happened in the very beginning is on a weekend I was making a roast of some kind, some meat in the oven, and I had the bread dough ready, made already, refrigerated overnight and everything. And I was just too excited to give this a try. And so once my roast was done, which was baked on a very low temperature, I have then put in the bread. So the oven was not at all completely cold. It was about, I want to say maybe like 120 degrees Celsius, something like that, when I was putting in the bread, and I turned it up to about 200 degrees. And I've let the bread bake for about 45 minutes. And the result was not very impressive. And that's what you can see here. The bread turned out relatively flat, definitely more flat than what I'm used to. And the crust also looked different. Like it looked like what it reminded me of was back when I didn't have a Dutch oven and I was baking my bread on a baking tray with some water underneath it to create steam. It looked exactly like that. It didn't have like the crackle or I don't know how to even describe that crust. It was just very smooth, very flat. But of course, I thought to myself, well, that's because the oven wasn't actually cold. Like this wasn't really, the test that I was aiming for. It was just me getting a little bit too excited to try this and, using it that way. And so the next time I've made bread, I really tried the cold oven start. So I have, again, just mixed my dough, let it ferment for about 2 hours, then shaped it into the bread basket, put it into the fridge overnight. The next day, starting with a cold oven, I have scored my bread, put it into the cold Dutch oven. I put it into the oven, turned the oven on to about 180 degrees because I was also thinking that I might need to do a little bit of experimenting with the times of how long it's baking and the degrees that I'm using on the oven. So this one was done at 180 degrees Celsius, and I again baked it for, I want to say I did that one for an hour, thinking that, it's a lower temperature, so it will need to go for a little bit longer. So I baked it for an hour, checking on it every 20 minutes or so. And it turned out, I would say, worse than the first one. So again, I was quite disappointed that there wasn't that oven spring that I'm used to and that I have seen with other people's videos who have done this cold oven start. And it was also very white for some reason. Maybe that was just because I didn't dust off enough flour off the surface of it. But, and here comes the big caveat. I was again noticing that I actually really like the taste of this bread. And that's what I've already noticed with that first test when I was putting it into like a semi-warm oven, that it just tasted better than my regular standard bread. And so I was thinking this time with the second test, the temperature was not high enough. And maybe I should try a higher temperature, but like my standard temperature, 250 degrees, but again, starting from a cold start. And that's exactly what I did for my third test. So again, same process as before, except this time when I took the bread out of the fridge, put it into the cold Dutch oven, which by the way, I really like using that because it gives me more control over how the bread is kind of laid in the Dutch oven. And because my Dutch oven is a bit smaller, it tends to like how would I say this, describe this? When I put in the parchment paper into the hot Dutch oven, I can't adjust how it's laying and like crumpling and everything. And so I like it better when it's cold because then I can make sure that the bread is like nice and has enough room to grow without the parchment paper getting in the way. Anyways, so I did that. I put it into the cold oven and I started it at 250 degrees Celsius and baked it for 45 minutes. After 45 minutes, again, thinking that it's a higher temperature so I can get away with less time, I took the lid off and gave it another 3 minutes or so to get the crust nice and brown. And I actually forgot to lower the temperature of the oven this time, and so it browned a little bit too much, and so I could taste that a little bit when I was later tasting the bread, but still the taste was better. And that's what I have when today I have baked my standard loaf. That's definitely something I've noticed. I don't like the taste of my normal, nicely puffed up bread more than the flat bread one. And that is like the most baffling thing to me that I can't figure out. Like, what is the difference? Because the difference is not in the fermentation, at least not until the point of me baking the bread. So I like the taste of the bread and the crust of the bread better when I use the cold oven start. And you can see how when I squish the two breads, the standard one and the one that I baked at 250 degrees, but with a cold start, that it's actually the cold start one that seems to be going back to its original shape much more quicker. Whereas the standard one, where I preheated the oven, that one, especially when I then cut a slice of it and I squish the bread slice, it's just very chewy. It's not as airy and not as puffy. And so that is just, again, completely baffling to me, because I would think that with a better rise and therefore more air in the bread, it's going to have more of that spring after you cut into it as well. And so I'm at a loss. I don't know what to do now, because on one hand, I like the rise and the look, honestly, of my standard loaf with the preheated oven, but I like better the taste of the cold oven start bread. So if you have any ideas why I'm detecting a different taste and why my cold oven start is not working as well as the preheating of the oven, definitely let me know down in the comments. I'm very curious to learn more about this and maybe to figure out how I can get that nice rise into the cold oven start bread as well. And I wish I could describe that difference in the taste to you, but it's a bit tricky for me myself to understand. It just feels, the cold oven start bread feels like it has a fuller flavor, whereas the preheated oven one is a bit more bland. I guess the texture makes a difference as well, where the preheated oven one is a bit more chewy than the cold oven start, which just feels more airy maybe, and that kind of makes a difference in the overall taste of it as well. I hope that helps. I know it's not much to go on, but that's kind of how I would describe that difference. And so to conclude, for me at least, there is a significant difference when I use a preheated oven versus a cold oven start. But the caveat being, it's not clear which one is better. It's just I get a very different bread from both of these methods. I will for sure keep testing this and trying to figure out how to make my bread better while exerting less effort, because let's be honest, I mean, the cold oven start is great because you, again, don't have to follow any timers. I don't have to keep going back to check if my light has turned off on the oven and how long it's been and, you know, whatever. I just put the bread in the cold Dutch oven, put it in the oven and set just one timer for whatever, 45 minutes, and that's it. So I really like the appeal of that, and I would love to figure out how to make this work even better. And that will be the end of today's video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.